I want to talk about building an anti-war movement in the United States with those who are doing that very thing. Very happy to be joined by Walter Smolarek, who's a national organizer with the Answer Coalition, and a good friend of the show, Kim Smith, who's an anti-racism and anti-war organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, based in South Carolina. Walter, Kim, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Kim, let me start with you. I mentioned that you were in South Carolina, not just because I love South Carolina, but specifically because your senior senator, Lindsey Graham, is like one of the most warlike individuals in Congress on this and other issues. And, you know, I just wonder, I know you all are working there in South Carolina to build resistance to escalation by the United States. How are you talking to people about this conflict, why it matters, why they should do something in a context where I'm sure a lot of the leaders in your state are, you know, really going overboard in promoting an aggressive U.S. policy?
Yeah, I had to stop myself. I promised myself I wouldn't roll my eyes too hard when you mentioned Lindsey Graham's name, but I failed. Um, but yeah, I think it's really important honestly, when we talk about war in general, war impacts everybody. Rania, you talked about earlier how it impacts Lebanon and how these sanctions impact Lebanon. And like just bringing it back to just good old South Carolina, like we have one of the largest training bases in the country at Fort Jackson. You know, we train the most soldiers, and so much funding goes into our military apparatus here that's being taken out of our communities. And I think talking to working class people, and when we talk to people about that, I think the biggest thing is to tell them like, yo, this money should be going into our communities. This money should be going into education. We should not, and I talk about this with you, Eugene, all the time, we should not have a quarter of shame in South Carolina where people don't have educational standards at all. We shouldn't have areas that don't have running water. But Lindsey Graham wants to continue this propaganda and put in warmongering and doesn't want to meet the people's needs here. And like the people are gonna suffer. And I think starting with that, when we're doing, trying to build an anti-war movement or build up the anti-war movement, because it's always been an anti-war movement. But like as we build it up, just letting people know like, yo, this is coming out of our communities. This is coming out of things that the people need, our basic needs. And I think that's just a great starting point.
You know, Walter, let me ask you this sort of related question, because I think, you know, when we're talking about this issue, you know, what people I think are saying is, you know, do you oppose what Russia did? Do you support what Russia did? And that's the whole sort of substance of the conversation about what should be done. And I think subsidiarily, it's sort of like, you know, if you don't aggressively go out and say you oppose it and foreground that somehow you're acting in a traitorous way. So I wonder just how you're responding to that question when you were out with the Answer Coalition, also working to try to raise awareness about how we got here and, you know, how a lot of the solutions to resolving this mean no escalation from the United States.
Yeah, well, I think it's a huge, absolutely essential task of the anti-war movement to explain to people that this conflict didn't just begin a couple of weeks ago or a couple months ago. I mean, in a way, this has really been building for like 25 years. When NATO began its eastward expansion following the collapse of the Soviet Union, absorbing more and more formerly socialist countries in Eastern Europe, including some former republics of the Soviet Union like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. That's really where this conflict began, and it's the consequence of decades of NATO aggression finally boiling over. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to defend the decision of the Russian government to invade Ukraine, certainly not. But it's so essential to get this context out there because the US corporate media is just a nonstop propaganda machine for the Pentagon and for the State Department. And so I think that's really our task here to explain that. So there's the issue of NATO expansion in general. And then there's what happened in Ukraine specifically. In 2014, in February 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine. The elected government, corrupt but elected government of Yanukovych, was overthrown in a US-backed color revolution. It involved neo-Nazi elements as essentially the sort of fighting vanguard of that coup. And that is what began the civil war inside of Ukraine. I mean, people in the east of the country initiated an armed struggle in the wake of that takeover. That's how you get the creation of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So this was a long time coming. And this war would not have happened if NATO, and particularly the United States, agree to cease its expansion and provide basic security guarantees to Russia, for instance, pledging to not station advanced missiles inside of Ukraine. And we should also note that the United States in recent years withdrew from two crucial arms control treaties, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Open Skies Treaty. That also sent an unmistakable aggressive signal to Russia. I mean, all of these facts are so important. I think getting them out there as aggressively as we possibly can is really the central task at this moment of the U.S. anti-war movement.
What are, I'm curious, the biggest challenges with this particular current crisis, and how does it compare to trying to organize against past wars? I imagine one of the challenges is that the role of the U.S. is much more hidden. The role of NATO is hidden. For as far as the media landscape, it looks like, if you're watching CNN or reading the New York Times, it's all Russia invaded Ukraine. It stops there. And so I imagine when you're talking to people and you're trying to organize against escalation, I imagine that's probably one of the challenges, no?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, that's a big part of the challenge here. I mean, it's different than, say, in Libya, where it was the United States going in and dropping the bombs. To explain this requires, I think, a lot more historical context. But there are certain basic things that I think remain the same. I mean, the point that you all were making before, that this is a war for the profiteers, for the military corporations. All of those things remain fundamentally the same. But yeah, I mean, this explanation, I think, requires a lot of persistence and patience with people. I think it'll become clear, though, how reactionary, anti-worker, and just generally, militaristic this whole war drive is. It's not simply about coming to the aid of the embattled Ukrainian people trying to defend their democracy. It'll become clear, I think, as this goes on, that this is part of a grand strategy, a much broader strategy by the United States to militarize Eastern Europe, to increase their troop presence there, to station advanced weapons inside of Europe, and to generally try to dominate the region and to dominate the globe. So I think we need to stand strong in these sort of initial, more difficult days, and keep building that movement over the long term.
Kim, one question I have for you, that when we're talking about war, we're always talking about propaganda. We're talking about framing, the enemy politics. And I wonder, someone like yourself who has done so much organizing around mass incarceration, around racist policing, how it hits you to hear sort of, it's like a democracy versus authoritarianism. And, America's good because we're a democracy. Russia's bad because they're totalitarian. Maybe I'll just stop there. But I mean, how does that strike you as someone who's done so much around the police state?
I think I just have to, sometimes you got to laugh to stop from crying, because it's just like, we want to talk about a dictatorship. We want to talk about, first of all, good old South Carolina, my grandparents are survivors of Jim Crow fascism. And my great-grandparents lived through that, rest in peace. So, first of all, if we want to talk about a dictatorship and we want to talk about authoritarianism, we need to look at, the U.S. need to put the mirror on themselves, right? During the 2020 George Floyd uprising, I saw tanks, I saw militarized police on protesters who were doing nothing but protesting for human rights, protesting for basic human rights, not to get shot by cops. And they were sending out gas cans and tanks and tear gassing people. And they were using the same tear gas canisters that Israel uses on Palestinians. So we want to talk about it. Let's talk about it. And when they want to talk about Russia is this and Russia is that, coming into International Working Women's Month, the Democrats didn't even pass the Women's Health Protection Act. It didn't have enough votes. So we're still fighting for bodily autonomy over here. We're still fighting for basic health care, because abortions are health care. We're still fighting for people not to be incarcerated. The U.S. incarcerates children. Our juvenile justice system is ballooning with kids. Little kids are in cages. We see our elders are locked up. They can't even get out. Our elders are dying from COVID inside prisons. We have people who are going against psychological warfare and torture, being in solitary. So I just think it's just ridiculous that the US can paint Russia as this, oh, the big bad Russians, which is just totally anti-communist propaganda, and not even take a second to look at what US does to black people in this country and poor people in this country, and just the horrible conditions that people live in that there is no excuse for.
I think that's a very good point, and I think we also saw this in terms of the criminal charges that they were giving people there during the uprising, right, Kim?
Yeah, exactly. Being a part of the Soda City Bail Fund, people were getting hit with felony charges for, we had people who were just out giving water to protesters and would get arrested and get a felony charge. Like, people's lives were ruined for protesting. Like, people, this showed up on someone's record that they had a felony for disturbing the peace and, assault to a police officer, and that person was literally just giving out water to protesters.
Wow.
That's it.
And
his life is ruined.
It is interesting how, and I'm not saying this is the reason why the US is escalating. Obviously, it's a benefit, but it is amazing how overnight all of the issues that you just brought up, whether we're talking about racist policing or mass incarceration, or the fact that like 1 million people have died preventable deaths from COVID, which the US completely failed at containing. The fact that Joe Biden has completely failed to pass any of the supposedly progressive ideas and policies that he campaigned on implementing. The fact that like our government has been a complete failure as more Americans fall into poverty because they couldn't renew the child tax credit. Like all of these things were piling up. This administration was completely unpopular. And now overnight, the conversation has changed. And it is incredible how beneficial war is on so many levels, because then everything else takes a back seat, including all of the issues that you're talking about. It just gets papered over. The fact that there's people still facing criminal charges from protesting, which we're supposed to celebrate when Russians do it, but in the US, it's like a bad thing. That's more of a comment than a question, but I'm just curious, like, does when this kind of war situation, this climate of a rush to war takes over, does it impact the ability to organize around these other issues?
I think in some ways it does. I think it does sometimes impact the way we can organize around these other issues, because people are so brought in by that US propaganda sometimes that they forget about the war taking place at home. And they're so focused and like get caught up in this like media campaign that the US has going, because the media, not y'all, we love y'all, shout out BT News, but like the usual capitalist media literally puts out all of this propaganda just to get American people to focus on it and forget about these other issues sometimes. But luckily, we're in such a great, I feel like, phase in the movement and the struggle that people aren't forgetting about it. People aren't like, I was so happy when, Biden had his State of the Union, not that I want to hear him talk, but the response, and people were calling out those contradictions and calling out, yo, you didn't talk about student loans. Yo, what do you mean we're past COVID? People are dying still. And it was just such a good space. It was a good place to be in. And it shows how forward this movement is going.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kim, I know you have a lot going on, so we're going to let you go here and not take more of your time, but I just wanted to really appreciate you. That's Kim Smith, longtime strong organizer on almost all the important issues to working class people in South Carolina with the Party for Socialism and Liberation.